So it is my pleasure to introduce Fatimah Jackson. Um, Professor at Howard, Professor of Biology and Anthropology at Howard, and Director of the Montague Cobb Lab at Howard University. She got her master's in biological anthropology, her PhD in biological anthropology, and her bachelor's in biological anthropology from Cornell University. She has been, gosh, yeah, I think you're at University of Maryland when I first met you, Fatima.
Yeah, I've been here for 20 years.
Yes, so Fatima was professor at University of Maryland, then came to UNC Chapel Hill, and now is at Howard University. She has worked successfully and extensively with contemporary and historic African American populations and has conducted research on substructure in this group and its complex influence on health disparities, particularly cardiovascular disease. She is particularly interested in gene by environment interactions in salt sensitivity and has published extensively on this topic. She has a background in human biological variation, population genetics, and a long-standing interest in research on peoples of African descent, both continental and diasporic. It's my pleasure to introduce Fatima.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all very much. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here. And this is the first time I've been back in North Carolina since I left UNC. So I'm glad to come to Duke, just to keep that rivalry going. Although it's a one-sided rivalry, I think Duke is higher ranked. So I especially want to thank Tommy DeFrance and Charmaine Royal, who encouraged me, and many times they wrote me, and the email would go to my junk mail, and it's just the opposite. It shouldn't have been in the junk mail, because this is what you want to do, you know? This is to have interdisciplinary discourse. And I almost wish that I had been able to speak a little earlier to give the biological template, which I think would have colored some of the things that were said subsequently, because we need each other. We in the natural sciences need the insights of people in the social sciences and the humanities in order to interpret some of the scientific results. Because, for example, in genetics, we can see that the gene is there, but we don't know when it came in or how it came in. That information's not there, and that's going to come out of history, out of social sciences, out of the humanities. And then, of course, we think that also we have a contribution to make to Black studies. In fact, when I listened to you speak, I said, gee, it sounds like I'm in Black studies. Anyway, I'm going to talk about biological perspectives on Blackness, and the way we do it in the natural sciences is that we talk from our slides. We actually look at you, so I'll be looking at you. All right, just had to put my little dig in there. All right, so again, thank you very much for the invitation to come here and to be a part of this important conference. And I wish that I could stay for tomorrow, but I have to leave tonight to get back for some other responsibilities. But I salute you having this conference and dealing with these issues, the complexity of these issues from an interdisciplinary perspective. Basically, this is what I would like to cover. I want to talk about the state of the science. I want to talk about evolutionary perspectives on human genetic diversity, because I'm an evolutionary biologist. I want to identify what are the key relevant questions from an evolutionary perspective, and it's going to be a little bit different than what you've heard before. And then this idea of universal or global Blackness, I want to really question that, given what I've said about human evolution. And then what are the Black universals or global Black universals? And then try to summarize it and return to this theme of how we can work together to enhance the quality and quantity of Black studies and enhance the quality and quantity of natural sciences. Because natural sciences without a historical framework or with an inadequate historical framework is a lie. I'm just saying. And I'm constantly confronting the lies masquerading as science over and over and over again. And I won't hold out and tell you I'm so happy to be at Howard, because Howard University allows me to think what I was thinking before I had to dumb down what I was thinking in order to explain it to my colleagues at UNC or Maryland or Florida or Berkeley or Cornell. Because most people do not understand the history of peoples of African descent. Therefore, they're at a real loss, but they're making policies all the time that affect peoples of African descent. So that's the travesty of official ignorance. So let's talk about the state of the science. I put this in because, and I'll say it probably again later on in the slide, human origins are in Africa. Okay, one more time. Human origins are in Africa. That means that the bulk of human existence, 7 million years of bipedal hominids, have been in Africa. And you start to see populations, a subset of humanity, moving out of Africa about 50, 60,000 years ago, successfully moving out of Africa. Probably people moved out of Africa back and forth, following the animals, you know, and they weren't saying, hey, let's leave Africa. No, they just, let's go across that river. Well, you know, that river then took them out of continental Africa. So we have to take the political and social context of Africa out of our minds when we're talking about the early migrations of anatomically modern humans. Anatomically modern humans show up about 200 to 100,000 years ago. And about 50,000 years ago, you get successful migrations out of Africa, either taking a southern route through what is now Djibouti, across the Red Sea into what is now Yemen, and going around the Arabian Peninsula and on into India, or taking the northern route, that is go down the Nile, make a right-hand turn at Suez Canal, go across into Asia Minor, and then go on into Asia or turn left and go into Europe. Actually, Europe and Asia are Eurasia. I don't know why we pretend that Europe is a continent. That's another joke. All right, so this is why I need to be at Howard, right? They had short tolerance for my honesty in other places. But in any event, what we have in the literature is something called ascertainment bias. That is, we know more about non-Africans than we know about Africans, even though all human diversity is a subset of African diversity. Let me say that one again. All human diversity is a subset of African diversity. It's not even the idea that it's a Venn diagram with Europeans, Africans, and Asians. No, it's Africans, Europeans, Asians, as subsets of that African diversity. And we have to keep that in mind because that really should flavor our discussions of who's Black. Because the truth is, from an evolutionary point of view, everybody's Black. Now, that doesn't address the political and economic inequities because we tend to focus on the impact of a few genes, about 120, 125 genes that influence skin melanization. And we make that the defining feature for someone's reality. But there's so much more to us than that. Anyway, lots of attention has focused more recently on archaic human species. These are Neanderthals and Denisovans. I'm sure you guys have heard of this. And we call it introgression. It just means that when one group of Africans left the continent, or of humans left continental Africa, was moving probably around what is now the Middle East, they encountered Neanderthals. And they didn't have a hostile interaction. They had a party. Genes were exchanged. And so we see some of those genes in contemporary Europeans and certain groups of Central Asians. And then in certain Southeast Asians and Australians, we pick up another archaic species called Denisovans. Now, we have sequenced the genomes of Neanderthals, and we've sequenced the genome of a few Denisovans, so we know something about their phenotypes and it's pretty exciting. I'm going to share that with you. We still have to develop a robust African genome reference database. And that's the database that Dr. Royal talked about in terms of doing precision medicine. You have to have something to compare it with. We don't have a good database for African people, but we're trying to do that. And that's one of my missions at Howard, is to try to do what I can to develop it, because in order for us to make sense out of the Cobb collection or the New York African Burial Ground, which are both those collections are in residence in the Cobb Research Lab, we need to be able to compare them with something. And so that reference database is so important. This I want to show you just to go back to the Neanderthal and Denisovan point. So we think within Africa that probably Africans are also admixed with an archaic species. We just don't know what it is. Some have said maybe Homo rhodesiensis, but we're not sure what it is. The work has to be done. I mean, so little is known about Africa. But definitely, the Neanderthal admixture, as you can see, probably occurred somewhere in Asia Minor, or as Ali Missouri calls it, Afrabia. And then also in East Asia, Southeast Asia, we get admixture with a Denisovan-like population, or it could be Homo erectus. And then what you see is that in the populations from here, they are going to retain variable amounts of Neanderthal genes, and the populations from Southeast Asia and Australasia are going to retain variable amounts of Denisovan genes. Now, they're predominantly modern human, but it looks as though we are, as a species, a hybrid species. This is just a visual abstract to depict the findings of a recent paper by McCoy, where they showed genome-wide interrogation of the functional differences between modern humans and Neanderthals. Now, why is this important? Because genes don't just sit there. They do things. And the really interesting thing about the Neanderthal genes is that most of the Neanderthal genes that have been retained in modern humans affect either testicular function, that is their immune function genes, or they affect cognitive function. Now that's really interesting, because if they're sitting and they're affecting cognitive function, we need to know how is that influencing, how are these genes expressing themselves, and how are they interacting with other modern human genes. I talked to a neurologist from Georgetown, and I said, isn't this like putting a Volvo part in a Mercedes engine? He said, no, it's worse than that. It's like putting an old Volvo part in a brand new Mercedes engine. Because in fact, the Neanderthals human split was 400,000 years ago. So this is really something to think about. And I'm going to suggest that as we talk about global blackness, that you think of it, just, humor me and think of it in evolutionary terms. Because all of a sudden, everything's flipped. The whole script is flipped, okay? This is just a workshop. This is an advertisement. Time for commercial break. We're doing a workshop on DNA screening. We hope to do it on Tuesday, April 11th. Anybody want free screening of their DNA? We're trying to build that reference database, and we're just doing it from saliva collections. But we're also collecting, which is why I really showed it to you, in addition to collecting saliva from peoples of African descent, from either the diaspora or from continental Africa, we're also going to collect saliva samples for the microbiome, because it looks like, yeah, the genes are important, but I'm sure you've heard of the epigenome. You've heard of the epigenome? So these are the chemical markers in association with genes. They're inherited through the environmental contact or things you see, hear, taste, smell, experience. You can pass them on at least for 4 generations. So an old geezer like me is still carrying around epigenetic markers from slavery. Now that's pretty interesting. And as far as the microbiome goes, we have a huge component of our bodies, of our genomes, are actually bacterial. So it may be that the biggest differences between, say, myself and a woman from Lagos, Nigeria, might be our microbiomes, not our genomes. In fact, a big difference between myself and somebody from Appalachia might be the microbiome as well. That might be because these genes interact with each other. And so the microbiome are the microorganisms throughout our body. I think it's something like 87% of our genome is bacterial. Incredible, isn't it? Okay, so again, the evolutionary perspectives on human genetic diversity. Behavioral and anatomical origins for modern humans in Africa, or humans in Africa. Why is that important? Because for a long time they could not, people in my own field, biological anthropologists and others, could not refute the anatomical and genetic evidence for modern humans emerging in Africa. But they said, oh, it was just the kindergarten. The real civilization took place outside of Africa. And now we're able, through archaeological investigations, to refute that. And people like Allison Brooks at GW have shown an abacus with prime numbers on it from Central Africa, dated at 80,000 years. 80,000 years ago. Because, you know, human intelligence goes up and down and up and down. And so what we have been confronting is a false notion that our current low status among African people has always been that way, and it hasn't. I mean, we have built great empires and great civilizations when other people were living in caves, and then it switches, you know? There is justice, you just have to live for eons. Just live long enough, things will even out. Okay, Africa is also the most tropical of continents. What that means in terms of evolutionary biology is that in the tropical environment, evolution occurs more rapidly, okay? So like a tropical rainforest will characteristically have 500 species in an area the size of this room. A temperate forest will have 5 species in the area the size of this room. So that's the difference in the evolutionary patterns. And furthermore, in the tropics, you don't have major ambient stresses. That is, you don't have, or abiotic stresses. You don't have cold weather, you don't have ice, you know, you don't have aridity in the humid tropical rainforest. What you've got are the presence of other organisms. So most of the evolution is in response to other organisms. So that creates a dynamic that produces much more heterogeneity than, much more diversity genetically than if you are faced with a really cold winter, you know, or ice, or high salt environment, okay? Now, these ancient DNA studies on Denisovans and Neanderthals that have been done, these are archaic species, very interesting, because for the Denisovans, you know, they had a cave they found in Siberia, and it was just the little end of the finger of a young girl. But they did some of the pigmentation genes and found out she was dark complexion with dark eyes. That would suggest that the distribution of dark people was once as far up as Siberia. Okay. Now the Neanderthals, on the other hand, are showing genetic variants that suggest hypopigmentation, that there was a loss of epidermal pigmentation. They were adapting to a very cold environment. What we think is that they were once in Africa, that there's the precursors of Neanderthals, then they separated out about 400,000 years ago, got trapped in Europe or in Eurasia. And then when the glacial periods came, they couldn't move back down south. And so that kind of isolation, and in a small population, isolation, inbreeding, or endogamy, what it leads to is rapid genetic change. And they were well adapted for the environment that they were in. You know, short limbs, stocky builds, cold adapted, even their large heads seem to have been cold adapted to help protect the brains from cold stress. So, you know, I don't want to depict the Neanderthals as in any way at all aberrations. They were not. They were another form of humans that were well adapted for their environment. And what's interesting is what happens when these tropical humans come up from Africa and they interact with the Neanderthals. And so what we think is that when the offspring that were born, when the mother was human and the paternal lineage was Neanderthal, if the offspring was male, that there may have been a disadvantage, a reduced survival for those individuals. But for the females, no, not a problem. We don't find Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA in any human lineages, only those cognitive genes and immunological genes affecting testicular function. When we look at ancient DNA studies in prehistoric and historic modern humans, it seems as though the genes coding for lighter pigmentation are fairly recent. 6,000 to 12,000 years, max. So that means if Scandinavia was colonized 15,000 years ago, it means the people who colonized Scandinavia were brown. So who's black? This is what I tell my students when the men have their DNA tested and they get their Y chromosome results and the Y chromosome matches with someone in Scandinavia, and they say, oh, how do we explain that, Dr. Jackson? I say, well, don't worry about it. You know, at the time that gene emerged, those people in Scotland were actually black. They were brown. The lighter color that we're seeing in Europeans is fairly recent, even within historical time. So I wanted to bring a picture of this individual. I didn't find it, but they did a study of a subfossil dated at 6,000 years, found in Spain, and that individual had dark skin but blue eyes. So even the combinations that we're familiar with today are not necessarily the combinations that go back into the past. So the phenotype, and I mention that because you all mentioned phenotype, the phenotypes have changed. Everything is changing. Of course it is. We're a living species. We are evolving. In terms of humans as a hybrid species, the proportion of the human genome that comes from archaic relatives is relatively small. In most Europeans and Asians, about 2 to 4% Neanderthals. There are a few little local exceptions, like in the Tuscan Valley. It seems to be a place where the Neanderthals held out for longer than other places. The Neanderthals ultimately became extinct. But in the Tuscan Valley near Florence, the Neanderthal contribution might be a little bit higher, but it's always in the single digits. No findings of people who are 50% Neanderthal or anything like that, or even 20%. In the Denisovans, the Denisovan genomes make up about 5% of the genomes of Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. But these sequences, even though it's a small amount of the genome, they have a big impact on human biology. So this is a characterization, an artist's depiction of a Neanderthal. And, he's quite modern looking. I'm sure you have some people in North Carolina look like that. Just put a hat on him, So this is showing HLA-A, a human leukocyte antigens. I know this stuff is funny, isn't it? You have to laugh at our diversity because, well, I did 23andMe and they keep sending me these notices. We found 30 more relatives. And I look at it, who are all these white people? I realized, that's the nature of, look, this is what populations do. We are more lovers than we are fighters, Anyway, this is the Neanderthals. Most distinctive things about the Neanderthal are the supraorbital brow ridge. They have a nasal prognatism and a really big head, a head much bigger than ours, and noticeably bigger than ours. But they had certain immunological markers that don't show up in Africa in the blue, but do show up where there's gene flow from Neanderthals into the modern human population. See? And so you can pick up some areas in China and Japan, where it's almost, 90% HLA-A, which was originally derived from a Neanderthal source. And these are in modern humans. These are the Neanderthal influence traits that I mentioned. And so people with higher proportions of Neanderthal genes tend to have more depression, greater addiction to tobacco, hypercoagulation, which you can imagine that additional platelets would have been advantageous in an environment where the healing processes were slowed down. Malnutrition, and I don't know what the physiology is behind that. Keratosis, I'm not sure about that either, or urinary tract disorders. I'm not sure what's going on with that. I understand, though, the depression and the hypercoagulation from an evolutionary sense, but some of the other findings, I don't know enough physiology to make sense out of it.
What would be the evolutionary explanation for depression?
It's that these cognitive genes are not as efficient as the human variant of those, the modern human variant of those genes. So it's like, as I said, the Volvo part in the Mercedes engine. It may work for 100 or 200 miles, but then it might stop firing properly, and that's absolutely normal. That's expected when you go from one subspecies to the next. So the relevant questions are, this is from my perspective, why are there currently so many non-African phenotypes around if we're all African? Because the demography skews our perspective, right? I mean, we look at Australia and we think, wow, those Scotch-Irish have been there all along. No, there's just a lot of them there. A lot of people who are derived from Scotch-Irish in Australia, but that's not the indigenous population. And there also has been a reduction in the indigenous populations. So you take a place like the Philippines, the indigenous population, they're Negritos. But you have a secondary migration of non-African looking peoples. Okay? And I don't want to say that the Negrito people are African people, because I don't even know when you stop becoming African. Like you leave Africa and then as soon as you cross the Suez, then are you non-African? I don't get it, I really don't understand. But I do know that if you look at Aboriginal Australians, okay, get that picture in your mind. When you do a genetic test on them, they cluster with Han Chinese, which just goes to show you that the things that we focus on, that we think make for universal blackness or global blackness, may have underlying genetic complexity. Even the way that melanin is bundled in South Asia is different than the melanin bundling that you see in the Congo. But the people are black, and sometimes they're blacker than the people in the Congo, So that's because melanization of the skin is under selection. There's an advantage to it. So wherever you've got ultraviolet radiation, wherever there are social pressures supporting dark complexion people, there's going to be more of those people being born and surviving, okay? And the underlying genetics will vary, because there are many ways, as they say, to skin a cat, many ways to produce dark complexion, especially if it's advantageous. So that's why the real question is, why are there so many non-black people? How did that happen? And what does that mean? And how, and then what's the relationship between genotype and phenotype? Because we think we're seeing genotype, we're just looking at phenotype. Now, are we any better than the races? Adaptive traits are not stochastically means random. They're not randomly distributed. In fact, they're the product of selection. So skin color is an adaptive trait. And so we have to ask the question in asking about global blackness, how genetically distinct are so-called black people from each other and from, I'm saying, hypopigmented people? Just because I don't know what to say. These words are just so messed up. Hypopigmented sounds like it's a disorder. It's not a disorder. I'm not talking about albinos, I'm not talking about a defect. I'm just talking about people who have less melanin. So maybe I should say, how genetically distinct are hyperpigmented people from hypopigmented people, just to have parity. And we don't know that yet. Why? Because we have not extensively studied Africa. We have not extensively studied Africa and all its diverse people. So until we do that, we don't really have much to say. And if we try to base our studies on a handful of African Americans, North American African Americans, I'm North American African American, but if you are North American African American, we're probably related to each other, because only 500,000 people came over here, and of those, how many actually reproduced? So come on, we're probably all related to each other. So do we represent all of global Africa? No, we do not. So if you want to study Africa, you have to go to Africa, and you have to really study it by ecological zones and systematically, in the same way that we've done in Europe. So I just want to show you some pictures of global blackness. But I would guess that if I ask you where these people are from, you probably couldn't tell me, not with any real assurance. So, for example, where these people come from? From India, Andaman Island. So, what about this guy with the blue eyes? Yeah, actually, he's just an American. I cheated. Okay, forget the famous people. Let's see, what about this guy?
Jamaica.
Oh, really? You think he's from Jamaica? Yes. He's from New Guinea. Oh, I love it.
Exactly.
See?
My point exactly.
But if you looked at him genetically, boy, would he look different than somebody from Jamaica. But you came to a similar phenotype with different genetic routes. See? That's what I'm saying. And which is why we don't want to bank on the genetics being uniform, because the blackness only goes so deep, Let's see, can I find some more? What about this lady? Oh, I know something you don't know. Bougainvillea.
New Zealand?
Yeah, near New Zealand. Near New Zealand. Okay, and let's see. Oh, Toronto. I know. See, now this is really telling. They look like they're from Canada, but they're actually from Venezuela. And you say, wow. So more than 125 different genes are responsible for skin pigmentation. And of course, being black, the phenotype of blackness or North American black, it's not just color, it's also nasal width and all these other hair, eye form and hair form and eye shape and so forth. But we're just discovering the genes responsible for those traits. There has been a lot of interest in skin color because the researchers who were doing the studies, they wanted to know also, how did we become white? How did we get lighter? What happened? Not in a bad way, but what were the forces, And more than 125 different genes are responsible for skin pigmentation, so it's not going to be an easy answer rather, for that question. And then there are these complex interactions, gene-gene interactions, gene-environment interactions that produce diverse phenotypes. So it's going to be a while before we figure this thing out. I mean, we can look at certain genes and know that they're coding for brown skin. Did the person actually have brown skin? Well, maybe, but it's a probability. Americans are notorious for not understanding probability. That's why people will, they buy, I bought 5 lottery tickets. My chances are 5 times greater. No, they're not. Gee. Anyway, all right, so global Black universals. Okay, so now I'm going to reiterate much of what has already been said, and I really commend you for that because it takes courage to say that really it's not so much the global Blackness, it's the global response to Blackness. It's the racism. It's the historic responses of hypopigmented peoples to darker peoples, which led me to wonder, what the hell is wrong with people? Why don't we just treat each other like human beings? Why are we paying so much attention to the color that somebody is? But we do it, and it's being done, and it has been done throughout the centuries. So, for some reason, maybe because of our Paleolithic past, and that we were fearful of the outsider. And so we, anything that marks someone as immediately not of our kin group is suspect. The embedded xenophobia of the Paleolithic era. But we're in the 21st century, so we have to really move beyond this. But the historic responses of hypopigmented peoples, at least within historical time, have been adverse for darker peoples. And that's not a North American Black statement. There have been historic and contemporary associations of hyperpigmentation with denigrated status. And again, I don't understand that, but I'm hoping to go to Spain and try to figure some of that out. Because I have a feeling that some of this stuff began in Spain, maybe some kind of beef, that came out of the Moors' invasion. I just don't know what it is, but what is it that would make people teach hatred to their children, to hate someone who's, but it's like it doesn't make sense. But stuff that really doesn't make sense is, why would you have a Black person nursing your baby and then hate that Black person? I don't understand that. Anyway, my summary. Universal Blackness is primarily a socioeconomic construct. So the economists, the social scientists, the historians, the linguists, the people in the humanities, you all are empowered to explore Blackness and all its many dimensions, and it's all legitimately Black, And there was a question that came up about how do we retain Black studies and keep it viable? And in biological species, the way a species retains its viability is to remain adaptive, to remain diverse. You don't want to go the route of the panda bear. You can only eat one species of bamboo. That's really a bad idea. You want to, be an omnivore. You want to be able to eat anything. Or as they told me in Liberia, they were chasing some animal. I said, "What are you chasing?" They said, "Food." Dang, that looked like a muskrat. Okay. Anyway, whatever, I ate it. Okay, biological university of Blackness is, I say it's genetically illusionary because of its complexity. And that I would guess, and this is probably advantageous for people of African descent, that we're so complex that you can't come up with, one germ agent that's going to kill all Black people and not anybody else. That's just not going to happen because of the genetic complexity. So I think it's so complex that we need computers. We need computational biology to kind of figure it out, and larger databases. And even then, we may still not figure it out because it's a moving target. Because new people are joining the ranks of Black folks, and other people are exiting. And a study was done in last year that reported on the large number of people who call themselves white American who actually have substantial Black heritage. So if this were Brazil, there'd be a lot more Black people in this country if we counted ourselves the way that they do in Brazil. So there are many ways to integrate the scientific information into Black studies. There are also ways in which the natural sciences can benefit from the systematic study of Black people from the perspectives of the humanities and the social sciences. And I didn't just take on this perspective. I've had this perspective all 99 years I've been alive. So I really feel that we have a lot to learn from each other. I benefited, even though I didn't always understand the references that you all made, like some of the songs in the books. I hadn't read any of those books, but I do know that John Edmondson, does that name ring a bell? Well, he's the black man who taught Charles Darwin about the tropical rainforest. Isn't that a part of Black studies? How do you think Charles Darwin, who was like a failure at medical school, failure at theology, got on the boat, learned his taxidermy from a black Guyanan, a man from Guyana, and went on to systematically develop the notion of evolution by means of natural selection after he learned about the tropical rainforest from a black man, John Edmondson, right there in London. So Black studies could expand to embrace some of the people who are Black scholars, but you don't know so much about. Or E.E. Just, Ernest Just, who was the father of epigenetics. The epigenetics I was talking about, that man was the father. I work in a building named after him. So I'd like to see a Black studies that brings in some scientists. I think that would be inspirational for our youth. And it would also help remind us that science is a human endeavor, not controlled by white men in white lab coats, but belongs to everybody, including women, who are probably some of the first scientists. Well, you guys have allowed this Jackson to preach to you, and I appreciate it. I thank you very much. Thank you.
So I had a lot of different responses because this is really interesting and it's really fascinating, and I'm trying hard to keep track of my train of thought, okay? Because I was all over the place while you were talking. One of the things, though, that leaps to my eye, thinking back over everything that you say, is that the lack of knowledge is hard work, yes. Right? And that lack of knowledge manifested in all the mechanisms that work against circulation of knowledge is part of what many of us are interested in when we say global blackness, right? So I say global blackness in order to say universal blackness is not an idea, right? So part of what I did as you were talking was to think about the different ways in which the work of science is embedded in the resistance to the work of science under certain circumstances. So when you were talking about, at the very beginning, when you said we need each other, right? And part of what you saw as a need that we could be addressing, that we who are not in the sciences, is help with interpretation. So I'm interested in a question that's even more specific than what you were addressing at the end. What could that look like under the restrictions of a curriculum, right? Given the divisions of knowledge. Black studies is a happy space, at least, of having cross-disciplinary inquiry, at least instituted as the mission that holds us together. But even in Black studies, the hard work of bridging disciplines, it goes on. It goes on far more civilly than it goes on in other places, but it's still hard work that's going on. So that's one question, the specifics of what Black studies and science might do in order to have a shape that's perceivable in institutional terms. And the second question I was thinking about was movements, right? Population movements, populations moving from one place to another. And I was interested in the doubling of movement itself. Moving and not being moved sometimes look a lot like each other, right? And so thinking about making movement not simply an empirical fact, but a fact that responds to a larger social and political context would be one of the ways where the challenge of Black studies could be to have science tell us about the resistance to thinking. Does that make sense? I'm thinking about the resistance to thinking because when you were talking about ascertainment bias, right?
Right.
And how much more we know about non-Africans, even though Africa is basic,
Is the
I
whole
think that's an act of will. It's not an,
It was done on purpose.
right, it was done on purpose. And the difficulty, it seems to me, is to get institutions to admit to their own fallibility, right? That the did on purpose also has been transmitted, not necessarily in our genes, but in our power hierarchies.
Yes.
And so to get an institution to say, it's not just about knowledge, it's political, is to work against the way institutions try to insist that knowledge properly addressed is not political, that our awareness of knowledge is somehow universal. If it's smart, I'm going to recognize that it's smart. And that if it's smart, I'm going to recognize that it's smart is actually contradicted by responses that begin in lack of knowledge, that point to the object and say, there's the ignorance. So I begin with ignorance, and from the confidence of point to that of which I'm ignorant and say, their ignorance rests. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, I mean, I could go on forever because I talk too much, so I'll stop. And
Okay, let me see if I can, should I respond to that right now? The three, and then see if that stimulates some more. So I'll start with your most recent question first. That intentional ascertainment bias. And I don't know, when I was 20, I knew exactly why people did things. And now, 100 years later, I can't really figure it out because I don't know why people do things. I don't know if they're lazy, stupid, or they hate me. I just don't know. But I know that you can't move forward with all the fancy-dancy genetic stuff that we talk about, like precision medicine, pharmacogenomics, proteomics, metabolomics, epigenomics. You can't move forward with any of that if you don't have a solid ancestral database. In other words, I have to know who to compare your genome with. The head of the dean of medicine was talking to me, and he was saying, yeah, we want to do this and all this. He was talking about clouds in the sky. We want to do all this stuff. And he said, I want to have Howard be able to do the same for our patients as Jimmy Carty had done for him, because he was suffering from cancer, and he's in total remission now. And of course, he had precision medicine. But that's because his ancestral database was known. So they could plug it in, and they knew what was abnormal and what was aberrant, and they could fix it, and they could recommend the appropriate drugs and so forth to treat his specific type of tumor. We don't have that kind of information, and we have to have the foundational base. And it all comes out of the notion of Europeans as norm. And I'm sure that you've encountered this in the social science research and psychological research, Europeans as norm. So whatever Europeans are doing, that's the human norm. And then whatever everybody else is doing, that's ethnic. It's like you go to the grocery store and there's food, then there's ethnic food, right? So it's that same twisted mentality. We have to move away from that. I think that the population movement issues are, so the truth is that humans have always been on the verge of some kind of diaspora, some kind of movement, some kind of migration. We don't know why some subgroup of people left Africa at that particular time. All we do know is that they probably weren't the first to leave, they were just the first to survive. So the ones that left before, they died. Once they crossed the Red Sea, they died. Or once they crossed, went down the Nile, then they died. Because imagine you're a hunter-gatherer, you go to a new environment, you're totally dependent upon as a subsistence person. You're picking what's in, you don't know what to pick. You don't know what animals to hunt. But something very interesting is going on in Africa, and I haven't quite figured it out. In Africa is the only place where humans were where you don't have the extinction of large mammals. Every place else we went, we meaning humans went, we exterminated the large animals.
wow.
Yeah, so I'm trying to understand, so what happened in Africa? And we talk about knowledge, and you really got me thinking about this when you all were talking this morning about ways of knowing. And is there something that people were doing in Africa that I don't want to say they were communicating with animals, but were they able to figure out where the animals were, where the danger sites were? I'm saying this because I used to live in Tanzania, rural Tanzania, and I did a lot of stupid things because I'm from the West. And, you know, a snake would come and I'd try to kill the snake, you know, with a broom. I mean, this is so stupid, you know. Or we'd be out and they'd say there's a leopard out, and my husband would be walking at night. So only God protects what, babies and fools, right? So we were clearly the fools. But I just want to say that for the Africans, we would expect, given the ferociousness of wild animals, of insect predators, of parasites in Africa, I don't know how the people survive. And yet they survive. You check their hemoglobin and they've got hemoglobins of 5. Pregnant women with really low hemoglobins. How are they giving birth? So there is some level of resilience. And I say this because I know that there was a concern about, you know, what is it you call the pre-black future?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so the absence of black people in the future?
Yeah.
No.
It's not it? Is it the absence of blacks? Well, I don't know what pre-black means, because there was no time when humans were pre-black. There's always been black people. I mean, we are the wild type. We're the norm. We're not the derived type. So, but I think that we have, because of the genetic diversity that's in Africa, something like 85% of human diversity is within African people. And that is a reason by itself to save African people, because we can't make new genes. We can only take them out of one organism and put them in another. And so, I mean, I think that tracking those migrations and seeing how the selection has changed gene frequencies is going to be very important, especially in this era of rapid climate change. Because we've had climate change before, but never as rapid as this. So we need to be able to predict, okay, how is this going to affect different human populations? I mean, we know that in Australia, because of the hole in the ozone, people are using a lot of melanin-infusing ointments to try to protect their dermis from the ultraviolet radiation. You know, we can only expect more of that. So, you know, these are critical times, but I don't think I would read them necessarily in a black-white context, even though that's one feature that's important. You ask about, let's see, Black studies.
Right.
Yeah. So
And the complexity of how needing each other might take shape in institutional terms.
Yeah, and I don't know quite, you know, on a larger scale, but I know in my own lab, we just moved into a brand new building, and it's one of those science buildings, so we're sharing it with about 14 other researchers. And so I don't have the private space that I had before. But what I decided to do is to get some headphones, and I'm going to blast really nice music for my graduate students. That I have the feeling that if we can listen to music, we can get inspired by various rhythms to do our science better. And we might see something as a result of hearing the music as we're thinking about an issue that we wouldn't see otherwise, you know? In other words, I'm trying to think of how to infuse my science with the humanities, you know, to draw out genealogical relationships and see if we can see something different than if we just do it the standard, cut and dry, two-dimensional, very traditional European way. Yeah, so I'm trying to think of how to do that. And fortunately, at Howard, they give you a lot of latitude.
Yeah.
They mostly don't care as long as you bring in money.
Mater.
Yeah, so you know,
Yeah.
I mean, love it,
Yeah.
but you know.
Yeah, but you know, when you said the headphones just now, I thought about something that I hadn't, in a different way than I thought about it before. In one of my prison classes, my TA, who is Iranian, decided that when we had, well, this was actually the first time I taught it, and it was first-year students, and my students were resisting every minute of the class. They did not want to think about mass incarceration. They did not want to think about poor people of color in prison. Their refusal was so adamant that it was infusing their bodies when they were sitting in the classroom. On the other hand, they're kind of like me.
Yeah.
So I was the entertainment.
Yes.
But they were still refusing. Okay, so my TA finally said, I'm interested in a lot of rap from different parts of the globe. And he said, what if I bring some of that in? And a lot of it was politically critical hip-hop music. And he said, and I'll play it, but not so that we talk about the content, but so that they relax their bodies, right? And so he introduced it by saying, you can do whatever you want to do when you listen to music. Do you lay on the floor? Do you lean up against your buddy? You know, just do those things. And it took a little bit of time, but their bodies relaxed prior to their minds relaxing. And in that moment, I thought, okay, so not only have I learned this, but it forced me to go back and to think about myself and how hard I worked not to be in my body. Right? So I was sitting there looking at the students, and in many ways, I was pissed off that they felt so confident being in their bodies doing like that. And I thought, I can't do that. Right? I have a different kind of responsibility. But
yeah, no, I think that's very important. And this is the 21st century education. We can't teach them the way we were taught. We have to meet them where they are. And we also have to make the bridge. And the European American students of today are not the same ones of 20 years ago or even 40 years ago. And that's, I think, is a good thing. I mean, their frame of reference, they actually know who B.B. King is. They actually know. And so if I make that reference, when I was teaching at University of Maryland, when I make that reference, there wasn't a question about it, you know? Whereas, you know, in years past, if they didn't know Bo Diddley, they didn't know B.B. King, you know? So I feel like there's a cultural merge that is occurring that will make even more complicated this question of who's black. And maybe we will be like someone said, whoever's black, whoever wants to be black is black. I don't know.